At 1 minute past midnight on August 19th, a 50% tariff wall was scheduled to slam down on nearly $20 billion of Canadian goods entering the United States. Milk, beer, wine, hockey sticks, plywood, cement, all of it taxed at a rate that trade lawyers were calling unprecedented. And with less than 48 hours left on the clock, the two governments were not just negotiating. According to CBC, they were, by some accounts, at an outright impasse. This is the story of how a trade war that started with a letter on a social media platform turned into the most consequential test yet of Donald Trump's tariff playbook, and why, according to multiple named sources close to the talks, that playbook may finally be running into a wall it cannot tariff its way through. To understand how Washington and Ottawa ended up here, you have to go back to July 20th, 2026. On that day, President Trump signed 3 separate proclamations invoking a law that had never once been used by a sitting American president in this way. It's called Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a nearly century-old provision buried deep in U.S. trade law. According to the law firm Wiley, which tracks international trade regulation for corporate clients, Section 338 gives the president authority to impose duties on a foreign country if he determines that country is discriminating against American exports compared to how it treats other trading partners. Trump was the first president in the law's history to actually invoke it, and he used it 3 times in a single day, aimed at one country, Canada. Each of the 3 proclamations targeted a different economic lane. One covered dairy, one covered alcoholic beverages, one covered motor vehicles. According to a White House fact sheet released the same day, the administration argued that Canada was treating American exports unfairly in exactly those 3 sectors, and that the new 50% tariffs were designed, in the White House's own language, to offset the burden and disadvantage on U.S. commerce created by that treatment. The fact sheet didn't stop at 3 sectors either. The actual list of covered goods, according to reporting from NBC News, stretched to include wine, some clothing, certain dairy products, and construction materials like cement and plywood. Altogether, the U.S. Trade Representative's office put the value of affected Canadian imports at close to $20 billion a year. Here's what makes this moment different from the tariff headlines Americans had already been living with for a year and a half. This wasn't the administration's first swing at Canada. Section 232 of a separate law, the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, had already been used to slap 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum, 25% on automobiles, 10% on lumber, and 25% on wooden furniture. Those tariffs were already baked into the relationship between the two countries. What the July 20th proclamations did was stack a brand new 50% layer on top of goods that hadn't been targeted before, set to take effect on a hard deadline, August 19th. That deadline is what turned months of slow-moving trade friction into a full-blown ticking clock crisis for negotiators in Ottawa and Washington alike. And Ottawa is exactly where the pressure has landed hardest. As the seat of Canada's federal government, Ottawa has become the nerve center of an emergency diplomatic sprint, with trade officials shuttling in and out of Washington, D.C., trying to strike a deal before the clock runs out. It's worth pausing here because the framing in a lot of American commentary makes this sound like Canada simply refusing to engage. That is not what the record shows. According to the Globe and Mail, Canada's chief trade negotiator, a career diplomat named Janice Charette, spent the entire weekend before the deadline in Washington, alongside Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc, following a full week of meetings that had already taken place. This was not a government sitting on its hands. This was, by every available account, a government working around the clock against a deadline it did not choose. So why did it come to this in the first place? Part of the answer requires rewinding even further, to February 20th of this year, when the U.S. Supreme Court handed down a ruling that upended Trump's entire tariff strategy. In a 6-3 decision, the court found that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a 1977 law originally written to let presidents respond to national security emergencies, did not give Trump the authority to unilaterally impose sweeping tariffs on nearly every trading partner the United States has. According to Al Jazeera, the ruling specifically struck down the fentanyl-related tariffs Trump had placed on Canada, Mexico, and China, along with the broader so-called reciprocal tariffs he had rolled out against more than 90 countries in April of last year. Trump's reaction to that ruling was not measured. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, he publicly branded the 6 justices who ruled against him as fools and, in his words, lapdogs for the Democratic Party. But beyond the rhetoric, the ruling had real financial consequences. Customs and Border Protection had collected roughly $166 billion under the now invalidated IEEPA tariffs. And a federal judge, Richard Eaton, ordered that money refunded to the importers who paid it. According to a court filing reported by CNBC, as of early August, the government had already processed and certified about $100 billion of those refunds, with more than 330,000 importers and over 50 million individual import entries still working through the system. A CBP official told the court that refund payments have been accelerating, with nearly $50 billion paid out in June alone, more than double what went out in May. That ruling could have been the moment Trump's tariff strategy folded entirely. Instead, according to PwC's trade analysis, the administration pivoted almost immediately, issuing a new executive order under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 to impose a temporary 10% duty on most imported goods, and later moving to Section 301 of the same law, a provision meant to combat unfair or discriminatory trade practices by foreign governments. In other words, the Supreme Court closed one legal door, and within weeks the White House had found 3 more to walk through, culminating in the July Section 338 proclamations aimed squarely at Canada. It's a pattern worth naming plainly. Every time a court or a legal challenge has slowed this administration's tariff ambitions, it has responded not by scaling back, but by reaching for a different statute. Now, back to the current standoff. The White House's own justification for the new 50% tariffs leans heavily on the collapse of a broader trade framework. According to the White House fact sheet, the Trump administration did not agree to renew the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, known as USMCA, in its current form, arguing the deal was not sufficiently beneficial to the United States. That's a significant detail because USMCA, the successor to NAFTA, has functioned since 2020 as the foundational trade agreement governing nearly all commerce between the two countries. Its absence, or at least its unsettled status, is part of why individual sector-by-sector tariff fights like this one have become the primary battleground instead of a single renegotiated treaty. Prime Minister Mark Carney's public posture throughout this fight has been consistent, and it goes back over a year. According to Bloomberg, Carney told Canada's provincial leaders roughly a year ago that Canada will not accept a bad deal, a line he has repeated many times since. That phrase has effectively become the government's public red line. And it hasn't just been rhetoric. According to the Epoch Times, when reporters asked Carney directly on August 17th whether his government would step in to help affected businesses or respond with reciprocal tariffs if the new U.S. duties took effect, he said, quote, "I have a plan that will cover all eventualities." He went further, telling reporters in St. John's, Newfoundland, that Canada has options, name-checking Newfoundland and Quebec specifically as provinces prepared to respond. There's a smaller but telling detail from that same press conference. Carney said he planned to translate a French phrase for Trump during their talks, maîtres chez nous, which means masters in our own home. According to the Epoch Times, Carney described it as a lesson, a phrase he has repeatedly invoked in response to both the tariffs and to Trump's separate repeated comments suggesting Canada should become the 51st U.S. state. That combination, tariffs plus statehood rhetoric, is part of why this particular trade dispute has taken on a political charge that goes beyond ordinary commercial friction. It isn't just about the price of plywood. For a lot of Canadians, and for the government in Ottawa specifically, it has become a question of national sovereignty. Let's talk about who is actually going to feel this in dollars and cents starting this week. According to reporting from North Country Public Radio, at a lumberyard called JP Building Supply in Rensselaer Falls, New York, just 15 miles south of the Canadian border, roughly a third of the inventory comes from Canada, including plywood sheathing that could see its import cost effectively double under the new tariffs. On the other side of that same supply chain, in Ottawa, a reclaimed lumber sales manager named Hank Vetter works for a business called WoodSource that ships 60% of its product across that same border. This is not an abstract policy fight playing out in press releases. It is a functioning cross-border supply chain built over decades that both sides are now scrambling to protect before a deadline that neither side controls unilaterally. The economic stakes go beyond lumber. According to the Globe and Mail, Quebec's provincial government has its own specific interests at the table, separate from Ottawa's federal negotiating position. Quebec Premier. Christine Frechette has been pushing for reduced tariffs on aluminum without giving up significant ground on dairy protections, a sector that matters enormously to Quebec's economy and politics. A spokesperson for the Premier told the Globe and Mail that, in the context of the ongoing trade war, the Premier continues to defend Quebec's economic interests. That's a diplomatic way of saying Ottawa doesn't just have to satisfy Washington, it has to satisfy 10 provinces and 3 territories with sometimes conflicting economic priorities, all while the clock runs down. Goldie Hyder, CEO of the Business Council of Canada, put it bluntly to the Globe and Mail, it underscores the difficulty of governing this country as a federation. So what does a possible deal actually look like if the two sides get there in time? According to sources described by the Globe and Mail as people familiar with the negotiations, the emerging framework would have Trump lowering his existing Section 232 tariffs on Canadian autos, steel, aluminum, and forest products. In exchange, Canada would concede on a long list of American demands, including issues around alcohol, dairy, and government procurement rules. Critically, that same framework would reportedly see Trump back away entirely from the new 50% tariffs threatened for August 19th, the ones covering electronics, alcohol, and dairy specifically. In exchange, Canada would reportedly remove some of its own retaliatory tariffs and make additional concessions, including on issues related to returning certain U.S. items or products, according to Bloomberg's reporting on the framework. Here's where the picture gets genuinely uncertain, and it's important to be honest about that uncertainty rather than smooth it over. CBC reported that as of the days just before the deadline, the two countries were, according to their sourcing, at an impasse. That is a strong word, and it stands in real tension with other reporting. Reuters, citing a Canadian government source, reported that talks were going well and that Washington, too, wanted an agreement in place before the deadline hit. Both of those claims can't be fully reconciled with confidence right now, and that contradiction is itself part of the story. Either the two sides are genuinely closer than the impasse framing suggests, or the optimism being relayed to Reuters is itself a negotiating tactic designed to project calm in the final hours. As of this recording, that distinction has not been definitively resolved by any single source. What we do know from Carney's own public comments is that direct leader-to-leader contact was happening right up against the wire. According to CBC News, Carney said on August 17th that he expected to have, in his words, opportunities over the next 48 hours to speak with Trump directly before the deadline hit. Reporting also confirmed that Carney and Trump had already spoken by phone on the Monday before the deadline, according to Audrey Shampoo, a spokesperson for the Prime Minister's office, though she did not disclose details of what was actually discussed on that call. That's a notable data point on its own. When two leaders are talking directly, one-on-one, in the final 48 hours before a major tariff deadline, it typically signals that both sides see enough value in a deal to keep pushing, even under intense political pressure, not to be seen caving in public. It's also worth putting this moment inside a longer timeline, because this is not the first deadline Trump and Carney have set for themselves. Go back to June 16th of last year, 2025, at the G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta. According to CBC's reporting at the time, Carney and Trump agreed to a 30-day window to reach some kind of trade deal, the first time either side had put a hard number on ending the trade war that had already been dragging on for months. Trump, according to that same reporting, sounded optimistic going into that summit, telling reporters he was sure the two countries could work something out. That 30-day deadline came and went without the kind of comprehensive resolution either side had signaled. And that history matters here, because it's a reminder that deadlines in this relationship have, more than once, proven softer than they first appeared. Whether August 19th follows that same pattern, or whether it becomes the moment the tariffs actually land, is precisely what's being decided in these final hours. There's also a wrinkle in the story that has nothing to do with the negotiating table and everything to do with the weather. According to the Globe and Mail, Dominic LeBlanc was scheduled to return to Washington on a Monday during the final stretch of talks, but his plane was turned back to Montreal due to weather conditions, forcing a delay in a round of talks that were already racing against the clock. Small logistical details like that rarely make it into policy analysis, but in a negotiation this time, constrained, even a weather delay becomes a variable that matters. Now, let's talk about the title of this story itself and be precise about what the evidence actually supports versus what remains a prediction. The framing that Trump's tariff strategy has collapsed is, as of this recording, a characterization, not a confirmed outcome. What has verifiably happened is this: the Supreme Court struck down his primary legal tool for imposing sweeping tariffs, forcing a costly $100 billion refund process, and a scramble to find alternative legal authorities. What has also verifiably happened is that, despite Trump's continued escalation using those alternative authorities, Canada has not capitulated to the specific demands laid out in the Section 338 proclamations, and has instead spent weeks in direct, high-level negotiations while publicly reserving the right to retaliate. Brian Clow, a former deputy chief of staff who advised previous Canadian leadership on U.S. relations and now advises companies on cross-border risk, told the Globe and Mail that the sheer intensity of these sustained negotiations means there's a real chance for a deal. S. Relations, and now advises companies on cross-border risk, told the Globe and Mail that the sheer intensity of these sustained negotiations means there's a real chance for a deal. That's an analyst's assessment, not a guaranteed outcome, and it should be treated as exactly that. There's also a more skeptical voice in the mix, worth naming honestly. According to reporting picked up by the Globe and Mail, Anthony Scaramucci, a former Trump White House aide, has predicted that Trump will ultimately, in the shorthand that's become common in financial and political commentary, taco on the tariff threat against Canada, meaning back down rather than actually let the 50% duties bite. That's Scaramucci's personal prediction, based on his own reading of Trump's negotiating pattern and it is explicitly a contested opinion, not a confirmed fact. It's included here because it reflects a real strand of analysis circulating among people who've worked closely with this administration, not because it's been verified as the outcome. There's one more figure worth mentioning, but it needs a clear caveat attached to it. A report referenced by Retail Insider Canada suggested that a full breakdown of the U.S.-Canada trade agreement could cost as many as 102,000 Canadian jobs. That number has circulated in Canadian business and retail circles, but as of this recording, it has not been independently verified against a named primary economic study, and it should be treated as a contested estimate rather than a confirmed projection. If a deal is reached that avoids the harshest version of these tariffs, that scenario would presumably never play out. If talks fail entirely, it's the kind of figure that becomes central to how Canadians evaluate the real cost of this standoff. Lumber deserves its own moment here too, because the tension between Ottawa and Washington over softwood lumber didn't start with this administration, or even this decade. Disputes over Canadian lumber exports to the United States stretch back for years, with American producers repeatedly arguing that Canadian timber, much of it harvested on provincially owned Crown land at government-set rates rather than through competitive private markets, amounts to an unfair subsidy that undercuts you, Hess lumber companies. That long-running grievance is part of the backdrop to the existing 10% Section 232 lumber tariff already in place before the July proclamations, and it helps explain why plywood and cement, both flagged in NBC's reporting on the newest 50% tariffs, keep showing up on the target list. For a business like WoodSource in Ottawa, shipping 60% of its products south, or JP Building Supply in Rensselaer Falls, sourcing a third of its inventory from across that same border, this isn't a new grievance suddenly appearing out of nowhere. It's a decades-old fault line that a new legal tool, Section 338, is now being used to widen. Canada, for its part, has not been passive in past rounds of this trade war, and that history is part of why Carney's warnings about having, in his words, a plan that will cover all eventualities, carry real weight rather than sounding like empty posturing. In earlier phases of the broader U.S. Canada tariff dispute, Ottawa imposed its own retaliatory tariffs on a range of American goods, targeting politically sensitive industries and, at times, specific products manufactured in regions considered important to U.S. political calculations. Carney's comment to reporters that all strategic sectors are being discussed, and his separate statement that he does not see the value in using Canadian energy exports as a point of leverage against the United States, together sketch out the boundaries of what kind of retaliation Ottawa is and isn't currently willing to consider. Ruling out an energy-based response in particular is notable, since energy exports represent one of Canada's largest and most consequential trade relationships with the U.S., and taking that option off the table publicly suggests Ottawa wants to signal restraint even while keeping other retaliatory tools available. Zooming out, this fight over dairy, alcohol, and automobiles is really a proxy for a much bigger structural question. What happens to two of the most economically integrated countries on Earth when the legal foundation for their trade relationship, USMCA, is left unresolved, and the fallback becomes a series of emergency, sector-specific tariff proclamations issued under century-old statutes never designed for this purpose? The United States is, by a wide margin, Canada's most important trading partner. That fact alone is why every twist in this negotiation, every phone call between Carney and Trump, every weather delay that keeps a negotiator out of Washington for an extra day, carries weight far beyond the specific tariff rate on a case of Canadian wine or a sheet of plywood. There's an inflation angle to this story that tends to get lost in the back and forth over legal statutes and deadlines, and it matters to ordinary households on both sides of the border, not just to trade lawyers and negotiators. According to NBC News, economists tracking the proposed 50% tariffs have warned they would push prices higher on both sides of the 49th parallel, not just in Canada. That's a distinction we're sitting with for a second. Tariffs are collected by the importing country, meaning American importers, not Canadian exporters, are the ones who technically pay the duty at the border. In practice, those costs tend to get passed down the supply chain, landing on American retailers, American builders, and ultimately American consumers, buying everything from a bottle of Canadian wine to a sheet of imported plywood for a home renovation. NBC's reporting specifically named hockey sticks, clothing, wine, dairy products, and building materials like cement and plywood as the categories most exposed to that price pressure if the 50% rate actually takes hold this week. The dairy fight, in particular, has a long history that predates this administration entirely, and it's worth understanding why it keeps resurfacing as a flashpoint. Canada operates a supply management system for dairy, poultry, and eggs, a system that uses production quotas and tariff rate quotas to protect domestic farmers from being undercut by cheaper imports, largely from the United States. American dairy producers and successive U.S. administrations, across both parties, have long argued that system amounts to unfair discrimination against you, S. Exports. Since American milk and cheese face steep tariffs once they exceed a fairly small quota threshold set under existing trade rules. That grievance is explicitly one of the three sectors named in the White House's July 20th proclamations, alongside alcohol and motor vehicles, and it's one of the toughest issues for Ottawa to concede on politically, because supply management enjoys deep cross-party support inside Canada, particularly in Quebec, where Premier Fréchette's public defense of the province's economic interests is directly tied to protecting that same dairy system. The automotive piece of this dispute carries its own weight, arguably more than any other single sector, because of just how tightly integrated the U.S. and Canadian auto industries have become over decades. Parts routinely cross the border multiple times before a single vehicle is fully assembled, meaning a 25% tariff under Section 232, layered with any additional 50% duty under the new Section 338 proclamations, doesn't just hit finished Canadian-made cars sold into the American market. It ripples through an integrated manufacturing chain that includes American-based auto workers and American parts suppliers who depend on Canadian assembly plants staying operational. That's part of why analysts like Brian Clow describe the current talks as carrying unusually high stakes for both economies simultaneously, not just for Canada. A prolonged tariff regime on autos doesn't cleanly separate into a Canadian cost and an American benefit. It threatens to raise costs and disrupt production schedules on both sides of a border that auto parts already cross more than once during a single vehicle's assembly. It's also worth remembering the broader pattern in Trump's approach to Canada specifically, because this hasn't been a single, isolated dispute. Back in July of 2025, more than a year before this current 50% tariff threat, Trump had already announced plans for a 35% tariff on Canadian imports, delivered, notably, through a letter posted to his social media platform and addressed directly to Carney. In that letter, according to reporting at the time, Trump linked the tariff threat partly to concerns about fentanyl flowing across the northern border, even though available data showed only a marginal amount of the drug actually crossing from Canada compared to other entry points. That 35% threat from the summer of 2025 was itself layered on top of already existing tariffs, and it set the tone for what's become a recurring cycle. Threat, negotiation, partial resolution, or delay, followed eventually by a new threat under a different legal authority once the last one gets challenged in court or expires. What makes the current moment feel different from that earlier cycle is the sheer scale of legal maneuvering behind it. This administration has now cycled through IEEPA, Section 232, Section 122, Section 301, and now Section 338, each time a previous tool got blocked, challenged, or simply expired. That's not evidence of a strategy collapsing outright. It's arguably evidence of persistence. But it is also evidence that the original, simplest version of the strategy, broad emergency powers tariffs applied unilaterally with minimal legal friction, is no longer available to this White House. The Supreme Court took that tool away in February. Everything since then has been an attempt to rebuild similar leverage using narrower, more legally defensible instruments aimed country by country and sector by sector, rather than in one sweeping stroke. For Ottawa, that shift has arguably created both a threat and an opening. The threat is obvious. 50% tariffs on $20 billion of goods would hit specific Canadian industries hard, from dairy farmers to hockey stick manufacturers to lumberyards feeding cross-border supply chains that run straight through towns like the one 15 miles south of the border in upstate New York. But the opening is this. Because these newer tariff authorities are narrower and more legally contestable than the sweeping IEEPA powers the Supreme Court struck down, Canada has more room to negotiate sector by sector, province by province, industry by industry, exactly the kind of granular deal-making that the Globe and Mail sourcing suggests is now on the table, with autos, steel, aluminum, and forest products potentially getting relief in exchange for concessions on dairy, alcohol, and procurement. As of this recording, no final deal has been confirmed by either government, and the 50% tariffs remain, according to the White House's own proclamations, scheduled to take effect. Whether that deadline actually arrives with tariffs in force, or whether it gets diffused at the last moment the way the 30-day window from the Kananaskis summit ultimately did, is something only the next public statements from Ottawa and Washington will settle. What's clear is that both governments have signaled, through direct leader-to-leader phone calls, through Carney's own description of the talks as delicate and intense, and through the sheer volume of meetings between LeBlanc, Charette, and U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer, that neither side is treating this as a foregone conclusion. One more detail worth flagging is where these final negotiations were physically happening in the days before the deadline. According to BNN Bloomberg's live coverage, U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer was seen meeting with LeBlanc and was also spotted alongside Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley during a visit to the Iowa State Fair just days before the deadline, a reminder that American agricultural states have their own direct stake in how this dispute resolves, given how much U.S. farm produce, including dairy, depends on stable access to the Canadian market. Grassley's presence alongside Greer at a domestic political event, rather than in a closed negotiating room, is a small but telling sign of how much this trade fight is also being managed as a domestic political story inside the United States, not just a bilateral negotiation with Ottawa. If the deadline passes without an agreement, the mechanics of what happens next are fairly concrete. According to Wiley's legal analysis, Customs and Border Protection would begin applying the new 50% duties to covered Canadian goods starting August 19th, and companies importing those products were advised to review their product classifications, assess potential exposure, and watch for further CBP implementation guidance. That's a fairly dry, technical description of what would, in practice, mean higher costs showing up almost immediately at ports of entry along the border, from Windsor, Detroit to the crossings feeding lumber yards like the one in Rensselaer Falls. It's also worth remembering that this wouldn't necessarily be the final word. Given the Supreme Court's February ruling and the ongoing legal fights over the administration's other tariff authorities, any new duties imposed under Section 338 could themselves eventually face legal challenges, adding yet another layer of uncertainty for businesses trying to plan more than a few months ahead. Before wrapping up, it's worth being transparent about where this account draws its facts from, and where real uncertainty remains. The details on the July 20th Section 338 proclamations and their legal basis come from the law firm Wiley's Trade Practice Analysis and from the White House's own official fact sheet. The Supreme Court ruling, the resulting refund process, and Trump's reaction to it are documented through Al Jazeera, NBC News, CNBC, and PwC's legal analysis of the decision. The state of negotiations in the final days before the deadline comes from CBC News, the Globe and Mail, Bloomberg, and the Epoch Times, all of which quote named officials, including Prime Minister Carney, directly. The business-level impact comes from North Country Public Radio's on-the-ground reporting from both sides of the border. Two things remain genuinely unverified or contested as of this recording: the precise state of the negotiations, given the direct contradiction between CBC's impasse framing and Reuters' more optimistic sourcing, and the 102,000 job estimate for a full breakdown of the trade relationship, which traces back to an industry-linked source rather than a primary, named Economic Study. Both deserve to be treated with appropriate caution rather than repeated as settled fact. So where does that leave things, with the deadline now bearing down on both capitals? Ottawa has spent weeks signaling it won't simply absorb whatever Washington proposes, while still keeping the door to a deal visibly open through direct talks at the highest level. Washington has spent that same window trying to convert a Supreme Court defeat into a rebuilt, narrower version of the same leverage it lost in February. Both things can be true at once: that Trump's original sweeping tariff strategy has run into real legal and political limits, and that his administration is still actively wielding significant tariff power against one of America's closest allies and largest trading partners. Which of those two realities defines this specific standoff? A genuine collapse of leverage, or simply a more targeted, legally durable version of the same pressure campaign, is still being written in real time, in meeting rooms in Ottawa and Washington, on phone calls between two leaders, and in a deadline that arrives this week. What do you think is actually happening here? Is this a Canadian government successfully holding its ground against sustained American pressure? Or is it simply the next phase of a longer squeeze that started back in 2025 and hasn't really let up? Let us know where you land in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.